Well, hello everyone. Back in the house in the studio and looking at some pretty significant winds picking up once again as we head through tonight and into early tomorrow morning. Some of us will be seeing calmer winds, whereas others of us are actually going to be seeing those winds ramping up as we head into the next several hours. And I want to make sure to highlight that, as well as take a look at the power outages, where we're looking at current power outages, as well as a continuation of those power outages and where some people might finally see their power start to get restored. So let's start there, because I know that's probably one of the more significant areas that we need to focus on. This is the entire region that is currently under those power outages all through the Bay Area, Sierra foothills, as well as parts of the Sierra. So we are going to continue to see all of that continue at least for the next several hours, and very likely that we'll first start to see most of the power outages in the Bay Area and on the west side of the state expire, whereas the east side of the state actually starts to see more in the way of increasing winds tonight through early tomorrow, meaning we're right back to one of those overnight events again. This is for the pg&e power safety shutoffs. So we're looking at, because of significant winds throughout tonight, we're going to continue to see some of these areas still affected by those power shutoffs. So far, we're still looking at quite a number of folks in the Bay Area, as well as for the Sierra foothills and the Sierra, still without power. But tonight, very likely we'll see some of this start to ease on the west side of the state, but the east side of the state starts to ramp up with power outages that will continue. And I'm going to show you why right now. Okay, so this is back to our graphics here, where we can see current winds, not too problematic. Now, they are still from a direction that's quite concerning, north to northwest through the valley, which are very dry. And I'm going to show you the humidity, which is just absolutely tanked over the past 24 hours. Whereas the foothills, only about a 5-mile-per-hour wind, but you'll notice that these are easterly winds. And what that means is the winds are coming from the Sierra. They are downslope winds, so they're very dry as they head downslope. Keep in mind, think about it. You know, you've got the windward side, the leeward side of a mountain, and think about how dry the Nevada side of the mountain is. Well, now we are experiencing those dry winds that come down the mountain here, and where we're seeing some of these contours, this is where we're starting to see some of those stronger gusts. So be aware, we still have some very isolated areas dealing with those stronger winds. Not so much in the Bay Area. This was pretty much reverse yesterday at this time. We were seeing much stronger winds on the west side of the valley. Now we're seeing that shift more so to the east side of the state. And we'll look at the developing weather pattern here too. Peak wind gusts today, 46 miles per hour for Fairfield. We saw closer to about the teens and 30s throughout the foothills and the Sierra. Now, that does not account for some of those isolated areas, as I was mentioning. Look at this. Kirkwood, 140 mile per hour peak wind gusts. Alpine Meadows, 119. Oroville, 51. Travis Air Force Base, 47. And Vacaville, 45. Now, humidity, like I said, when we are looking at wind directions out of the north to northwest or easterly winds, look what that does to our humidity. We are at 9% right now for Sacramento and South Lake Tahoe. Even San Francisco, which is so used to seeing that muggy, cold, damp fog and the cold conditions along the coast, 29% humidity. Again, because of the winds that are downslope, drawing as they push off the coast. There's not going to be much change in that for tonight, except for the fact they won't be quite as gusty for as prolonged period of time. We still have our red flag warning in effect, and that will continue until 5 o'clock tomorrow for the areas in red. Wind gusts up to about 30 miles per hour. Not quite as many gusts at that level throughout the valley, but for the mountains and the foothills, still expecting tonight to see wind gusts at about 40 to 60 miles per hour. So I'll go back over to these power shutoffs. That's why I'm very much expecting for the foothills and the Sierra for the potential for these power outages to continue much longer than, say, for the coast. Keep in mind, all the power officials have to go out, inspect the power lines before they can start turning things on, just to make sure that with these winds that are still expected to pick up tonight and still very dry conditions, that they don't have anything that is too concerning. Now, also, we go to our wind advisory. That still continues for the valley until 8 o'clock tonight, but you'll notice that the timeline is much different for the mountains and the foothills. That will continue for this region right here until 2 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. We've got our low that has been in opposition to this high pressure ridge, and in between those two we get those very strong offshore winds. So we've got these counterclockwise winds of the low and the clockwise winds of the high, and it just presses those winds straight off the coast. As that low starts to move its way east, we're starting to see this whole event shift from the west side of the state to the east side of the state, which would be impacting more so the foothills and the Sierra for tonight. Temperatures with this low pressure system have been quite cold, so when we consider the potential for power outages continuing, we're already near the freezing mark for Truckee, South Lake Tahoe at 41. Foothill locations, we're going to stick in the 60s and 50s for overnight lows, which is still going to be quite cold for tonight, given that we've already seen one night of power outages. So let's get to those winds. What's going to be happening for tonight? Well, for much of the valley and the west side of the state, we actually see those winds come down to, say, 5-10 miles per hour. Some areas about 15 miles per hour. But again, what I want to focus on are the contours. Here is our key. And you can see the colors really ramping up as we get those higher wind gusts. And we'll certainly see the potential for that right through here, south of Highway 50. But watch what happens overnight tonight through early tomorrow. So by 2 a.m., look at how that area has expanded. Again, I'll go back here. At 9:30, most of the strongest winds south of Highway 50. But as we put this into motion, look how that expands throughout the 80-50 corridor, north of I-80 and south of Highway 50. Much more of our folks in the southern mother lode for Tuolumne and for Amador. We're going to be affected in much greater numbers for tonight with some of these stronger wind gusts than, say, even last night. 80-50 corridor, still really high wind gusts expected for tonight. So again, now that we've seen the modeling on what's going to be happening with these winds, we take a look at this outage map. With the winds starting to back off here for the Bay Area, once those power lines are inspected, it's very likely that we'll start to see some of these power outages ease. Whereas over towards the east side of the valley, since we'll see that secondary ramp up of winds, these areas will most likely continue to be without power through tonight into the first part of tomorrow. So when do we finally start to see these winds for everybody in the foothills and the Sierra calm down? Well, again, here's our timeline right here in the upper right. And here's a look at the sustained winds. These are going to be some of the contours where we're seeing some of the strongest winds. And I'll just start to move this forward. And we'll see a much smaller area affected by these winds by the time we get to the afternoon. But even as we awake tomorrow in the morning, we're still seeing some areas that are going to experience some stronger gusts in the North Bay Hills, not quite as pronounced as, say, here throughout the foothills and the Sierra. So we could see a few of those power outages continue north of I-80 and just off to the west of 505. So for Sonoma, Napa, Solano, could still see some power outages in that area. But most prominent are going to be those winds over towards the foothills and the Sierra tomorrow morning. Now, as we continue through on this timeline, what we'll find is by 9 o'clock, we're starting to see some of this ease, at least not as widespread, certainly, as what we have overnight tonight through roughly about 7 o'clock tomorrow morning. And then finally, by the time we get to about noontime, we'll see, unfortunately, just little pockets here of some higher fire danger, but not quite the widespread activity as what we had been seeing. But you'll also notice that we start to see this easterly component drive in through the valley, which will keep that humidity very low through tomorrow. Even the Bay Area, seeing those offshore winds for tomorrow during the day. If your hands are dry, your hair has that static going on, expect more of that for tomorrow just because of these very dry winds, which will also keep that fire danger pretty high through tomorrow. By the time we get to tomorrow afternoon into the early evening, starting to see things really wind down here. We don't see those sharp contours anymore throughout the North Bay Hills, the East Bay, the foothills, and the Sierra. And that's when we really expect some of the extreme conditions to not only wind down, but also potentially some of the power outages and for Northern California. So what about the fire danger? Those are just the winds. What do the winds pose as a risk to our fire threat? And we take a look at this next graphic, and this will also show where we have the moderate to high fire danger. Moderate, of course, is going to be in the yellow. High is going to be in that red category. And again, up in the right-hand corner is going to be our timeline. As I mentioned, we're going to see some pockets in here that'll still have some of those higher gusts, so very much expect to see some of those higher fire danger pockets right where we typically see those offshore winds through Solano, Napa, even parts of Sonoma County. We'll still be seeing some of that higher fire danger over towards Santa Rosa as well. Not so much for the foothills and Sierra yet, but again, we're pretty early in the game here at 8 o'clock. Once we put this into motion, we see this start to expand a bit more north of I-80 through the 80-50 corridor, not quite as high south of Highway 50, even though we'll see some of those stronger gusts. And keep in mind, we still have that creek fire burning there as well. Once we get through the early morning, this is what it's looking like. 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock in the morning, not a real terrific outlook here for some of the coastal hills, but the Sierra starting to see things come down ever so slightly as our winds aren't quite as problematic, but we'll continue at least through a good part of the early Tuesday forecast with some higher fire danger before everything starts to wind down here by the afternoon. So this is going to be a much better outlook by about 6 o'clock tomorrow. At this time tomorrow, if we can make it through this wind event, we're looking pretty good here as far as our fire danger. Just returning back to that red flag warning, when does it expire? When is it in effect? It's currently in effect throughout almost all of Northern California, but the Bay Area has finally lowered the threshold. They're not meeting necessarily all the criteria to be under that red flag warning, so they are now out of the red flag warning. But for the valley, the coastal hills, the foothills, and the Sierra, we're going to continue with that red flag warning until 5 o'clock tomorrow, with potential wind gusts up to about 30 miles per hour. For the foothills and the mountains, 40 to 60 mile per hour wind gusts. And keep in mind, some of those drainage areas, the canyons, wind-prone areas could see slightly higher gusts than even that. Some of those peak wind gusts, if you're just joining us, check it out. This is what we saw earlier. Kirkwood, 140 mile per hour peak wind gusts. Alpine Meadows at 119. Oroville, 51, Travis Air Force Base, 47, Vacaville, 45. Now, in the valley locations, we were seeing wind gusts anywhere from about 30 to almost 45 miles per hour, of course, including that Fairfield peak wind gusts. San Francisco also with a 35 mile per hour peak wind gust. But for widespread activity, it wasn't too much of a problem here for the foothills and the Sierra, but we did see those pockets, those wind-prone areas that had pretty high fire danger coming in and those strong gusts. Again, just returning to the latest PG&E power map, where are we seeing most of the power outages continue? We're starting to see some of these, this just updated, some of these communities that are in the East Bay, coming out of the customers affected, the number of customers affected, some of the purple triangles that you're seeing here starting to be much more limited in parts of the Bay Area as red flag warning conditions start to ease. That won't be necessarily the case for the foothills and the Sierra. We'll see that continue, so just be aware. Oh, and my computer just went black, but that's perfect timing because I was just going to say You want to stay tuned to ABC 10 as well as abc10.com. We'll have the latest on LNT. That's at 11 o'clock. Kind of give you the update on what's happening as those winds actually start to ramp up as we come on the air tonight for the foothills and the Sierra. So it's been quite a past 24 hours. We'll continue to monitor this online and on air. In the meantime, have a good night.